May, and this is May's Crochets. I'm a beginner crocheter sharing my Learn It to Crochet journey. And today I want to share my top 5 beginner amigurumi tips. I've only been crocheting for a few months now, and I've learned some things along the way. So I wanted to compile my top 5 tips and share them with you all. So let's dive in. Number 1 is to experiment. There are so many different possibilities with amigurumi and crochet in general, and I definitely encourage you to experiment and see what works for you. This covers so many different areas. Of course, things like experiment with different yarns, experiment with different crochet hooks, experiment with different crochet hook sizes, things like that, of course. But also techniques. How do you hold your crochet hook? There's different ways to do it. You can hold it, I guess it's called knife grip or pencil grip. Or maybe there's even other options out there too. Like, try the different options and see what feels right for you. Do you want to use safety eyes, or should you try embroidery eyes? Or if you are using safety eyes, there's a lot of different types of safety eyes you could use, or sinker eyes. There's all kinds of different eyes you can use. If you embroider eyes, again, tons of possibilities for how you actually embroider those eyes. All kinds of different options. Use different tools, like try different stitch markers. There's all kinds of stitch markers out there. See what works for you. I will share my stitch markers that I got that I really, really like are this. They're from Coco Knits, colorful split ring markers. I love these. They are, can I show you? They're like this circular spiral where you just sort of they're really, really smooth, and you sort of just slide it on, and they have different colors. They're magnetic, which is great because they stick to things, so it's harder to lose them, but not everyone likes these. Some people complain that these sort of open stitch markers just like slip off, and they want something that's closed. Tons of options. Again, experiment. Think about what your learning style is. If you're a beginner, right, there's different ways that you can learn how to crochet. Do you prefer following along with a video tutorial? Do you prefer maybe just doing a video to see sort of some of the stitches and then following a written pattern? Do you like to write down with like paper and pen as you go? Or do you want to not write at all? Or do you want to mark something like on a computer or on your phone? Do you want to like just go through a pattern, even if it's messy, and learn as you go and then just keep going? Or do you want to, as you go, if you make a mistake, do you want to undo it, redo it, and continue on until you get it really, really perfect? Like, these are all great options to think about, sort of what's your preference and what is your style and how are you best going to learn. And there's just tons of options out there. And so I encourage you just to try them all, try them all, see what sticks for you, and go with that. So that is my tip number 1. Tip number 2 is to count. Counting is your friend. Maybe that's obvious. I don't know. When you're following along with a pattern and you're trying to count up the stitches in the row, or the actual number of rounds in the pattern, you definitely want to be keeping track as much as you can, especially at the beginning. My personal preference, because I'm like, I don't know if I'm OCD or what, I like to count 2 different ways. So I have like a double check to make sure that I'm actually doing the right row. Not always for the stitch count, but certainly for the row count. I have a whole video that I'll link here where I talk about row and stitch counters. I'm actually a coder, and I built my own online row and stitch counter, which is linked from that video, and I'll also link it here if you want to take a look at that. I built it mainly because I wanted a tool that I could use that was exactly kind of what I wanted. It's both a row and a stitch counter, so you can have 2 separate counters going as you're building a project. But yeah, I will link that video if you want to take a look at that. Some people prefer to use, just paper and pencil, old school, or type it on a computer or your phone, like Notes app, or there's actual other apps, out there built for this. Or there's like actual physical stitch counters you can use that you turn as you go. I actually have one of those, and that's sometimes my preferred sort of second method. Is I'll use my online counter for my row count, and then I'll also use my turny little counter, because it depends on the yarn you're using, but sometimes it's a little hard to tell and go back and count and like see actually how many rounds you have if they blend together a little bit. So yeah, counting is your friend, assuming you're like me. I mean, some people are much more sort of YOLO, or they can kind of figure out what the count is as they go, and they maybe don't want to be counting so much. But every time I neglect to count, or I tell myself like, I'll just count in my head, I lose count so quickly. I tell myself, especially when it's rounds like 24 or 36, like 48. Like by the time I get past like 10, I'm like, what? Which one was I on? So you can count it back up, but sometimes it's easier not to. So I'm still in the habit of like marking every stitch as I go for certain, depends what yarn I'm using, depends what pattern I'm doing. And especially for those sort of more complicated rows or rounds that are like, do single crochet twice and then an increase, 8 times or whatever, things like that. But especially as a beginner, I find that counting is your friend. So that's my tip number 2. Tip number 3 relates to sewing pieces on, and that is to use pins. So when you're doing amigurumi patterns that involve sewing pieces on, so not every pattern, some patterns are no sew, where you don't actually need to like make extra pieces, where you do it, sew them on like a 3D piece. But most of what I've done up until now have been patterns that involve at least some amount of sewing. I've done so much just like freehand, like, oh, it says that I should put this little like wing or ear or whatever tail between rounds like 9 and 10. Let me just put it here. And then there's a second one that's supposed to be exactly symmetrical and line up. And I kind of just freehand it. And it always comes off at least a little bit off center or asymmetrical or whatever. Like, symmetry is hard. It's really hard with amigurumi. And this is a tip that it took me a while to come across, and it makes a ton of sense. Pin your pieces before you start to sew them on, especially when it's something like 2, when you have things that you want to be symmetrical. If you're making like 2 ears that you want to be symmetrical, 2 wings, 2 legs, whatever it is. I found that just using regular sewing needles or not needles, sewing pins for this can work okay. It's not great. The pins that I have, like just a little from a sewing kit and a pin cushion, sometimes they don't super like stay when I stick them in, but it's enough to get them situated where I can kind of like eyeball like, okay, these 2 are in the right spot and I'm gonna like proceed with this, as opposed to when I don't use pins and it always it always fails me. I'm sure there's other ways to pin as well. I've seen that sometimes people use those like interlocking stitch markers that actually close, that almost look like safety pins. I think it depends exactly what you're pinning. And if you can get those to sort of interlock, that's a great option too. I'm sure there's other options out there as well. But I really encourage you to try this out. I know a lot of people out there they hate sewing. They hate sewing on pieces. That's their least favorite part of amigurumi. And I think it's because it's hard. Like, I totally get it. It's really hard to get the piece in the exact spot that you want. And so anything we can do to help us along the way, I think is good. So yeah, try pins. See if that helps you out. Give that a shot. When I first started amigurumi, I did not even think to do anything like using pins, and I always freehanded it, and it like just always came out wrong. So once I started using pins, I still haven't perfected the art. Like, I still don't quite have it down in terms of how to use the pins and exactly like do it correctly, but I'm working on it, and I definitely encourage people to try that out when they're starting off. So that's tip number 3, to use pins for sewing. Tip number 4 goes back to stitch markers. Stitch markers are your friend. Again, here's my Cocoa Knits ones. But again, any kind, there's all kinds of different kinds out there. There's locking ones that don't lock. There's like pretty ones with little dangly, almost earring looks. There's like just these little like safety pins. You can even just use a bobby pin or a paper clip or just like a little piece of yarn. There's all kinds of things you can use. But marking the stitches is definitely your friend. I think it's very common with amigurumi that you mark the first stitch of every round, because otherwise you sort of don't know when you finish a round. And so I guess you could count, but it's important to know kind of when you're up at the end of the round. And so that's why you would use a stitch marker in just that one stitch of the round. So like one maybe stitch marker per project. But don't be afraid to use more stitch markers if you find that they would be helpful. The first time I used chenille yarn, which I have a video about, which I'll link, I actually used a stitch marker in every single stitch in my entire pattern that I made, because the stitches were impossible to see, especially the first time I used chenille. Since then, I've gotten a little bit better about it. I don't use, stitch markers in every single stitch anymore. But that first time when I very first used chenille yarn and I could not see my stitches at all, I actually found that putting a stitch marker in every single stitch meant that when I did the next round, I knew exactly where my crochet hook should go. And that helped me learn kind of as I went, like, okay, I'm starting to learn, like, where does my crochet hook go? Okay, there's like a stitch marker here. This is what the hole looks like, even though you can't really see it super well. That was definitely a help for me. Also, like black yarn, even if it's a kind of a good yarn that you're supposed to be able to easily see the stitches in, if it's black, it automatically is a little bit harder to see the stitches. And so definitely think about using a stitch marker if it's helpful in some of those stitches too. I mean, you certainly don't have to do every single stitch, but like as you find it helpful, for sure do. And especially also when you're doing larger rounds, if you are trying to count things up and make sure you're kind of keeping the count correct, I've one thing I've tried that has worked well for me, especially when I was using like much thinner yarn, and I found myself counting kind of over and over again, but it was like really small to see, was I used a stitch marker every like 10 stitches or every 5 stitches or whatever number you pick. It makes it so that instead of like I had a round of 48 or something, and like I would make it to to stitch number like 36, and then I'd go back to the beginning to like count to make sure I had the right number. It's like, okay, how can we save ourselves a little bit of effort here if you use more stitch markers kind of to mark different increments as you go? So every 5, every 10, whatever it is, it makes it so that it's not as hard to make sure you only have to count back to the last stitch marker instead of all the way from the beginning. So I definitely encourage you to do that if that makes sense for you, kind of depending again what yarn you're using, how easy it is to count, how big your round is. But stitch markers, I definitely would say, are your friend. So that was tip number 4. Tip number 5, my last tip here, kind of relates to that. And it's just to, do the easy thing. Pick yarns that are beginner friendly. I will say this is advice that I myself did not follow. I did start primarily using the Woobles Learn to Crochet kits, which they call it Easy Peasy yarn, which is this beginner friendly yarn where it is really easy to see the stitches. And I've done a bunch of that, which yes, good for learning. You can see the stitches clearly. It's great. It's a medium size 4 worsted weight yarn, which is a great beginner yarn. I think it's considered like a t-shirt yarn. So it's you can really see the stitches, but I was so excited to do chenille yarn because everyone loves it. It's so soft. And I feel like I instantly put myself into like crochet hard mode. You do not need to use chenille right away. You can work your way up to that. You can do easier beginner friendly yarns. I also started a set of projects where I used it's Hobie Rainbow Cotton 8/4 yarn. I have a full video about unboxing that yarn. It's tiny and I did not expect that. It's a fingering weight yarn, which is like really, really small, but I did not realize that when I ordered it. And it's like, again, it's tiny. So for some reason, it's like I did the Woobles, which yes, beginner friendly, good. But then I bought this, chenille yarn, which is thick and hard to see the stitches. And then this opposite end, small, tiny, thin yarn, hard to see the stitches and just like really hard to, tiny, hard to work with. And so again, I put myself in crochet hard mode when I did not probably need to. So don't do what I did. Maybe stick with kind of medium weight yarns for a little bit until you have it figured out. Do research, see what other people are using for beginner yarns. See what other people say, what yarns are good for amigurumi, what other people say is like sort of the best yarns that you can really see your stitches very clearly. That will definitely make things easier. And then you can like slowly level your skills up as you go, instead of what I did, where I kind of instantly put myself into hard mode. Don't do that. I mean, you can if you want, if you're up for the challenge. And in the end, I think it worked out fine for me. But I would encourage you to kind of stick with beginner yarns, as it makes sense. So there we go. Those are my top 5 tips for amigurumi from a beginner crocheter. I hope you find those useful. Let me know in the comments what thoughts you have, if you have other tips, or if you have any other similar thoughts like this. So with that, thank you so much for keeping me company, and I'll see you next time. Bye.